Welcome for the last small talk of this Tashweesh festival. On this Saturday evening, we invited Nadje Al-Ali, Rachida Aziz, and moderator Carolina Maciel de France. She was here like every night. Thank you, Carolina, for giving us all these conversations. And voila, so they will have a conversation tonight with each other and with you. So go ahead.
Thanks, Anne. So as Anne said, I've been here every night and I've been learning. And tonight's talk, I'm going to be really honest with you, has been the most difficult to prepare. Because it's only 45 minutes. I'm already taking up one now, introducing. And these two, both of them deserve 45 minutes by themselves because what they do is so... it's not easily conveyed within certain frames of time. And also you work within the same frames, but it's completely different. Your settings, your context, your strategies. So instead of, I'm gonna lay aside all of my preparation and just listen as you're listening. And I want you both to tell me about the differences you see within this framework of large and international and transnational themes that are feminism, that are intersectionality. And at some points, I'll be asking you to be really specific about what you understand by that. So Rachida Aziz is based in Brussels, is an author, and someday I will interview her about her book, especially about that, I hope. And Nadje Al-Ali is a doctor based in UK still, and has worked in countries like Lebanon and Egypt. So different practices. I hope tonight we can learn about the different faces of feminism. Would you care to start, one of you two, about the different faces of feminism all over the world? Maybe Nadje?
Well, so to sort of give you a little bit more background, I'm half German, half Iraqi, and I grew up in Germany, but much of my academic and activist work has been in relation to Iraq, and it was kind of at some point when this situation became so terrible in Iraq, it wasn't a matter of choice. I felt that I should do something with my privilege in relation to Iraq, especially after 13 years of sanctions and the invasion and the occupation. So much of my work has been academically and in activist terms in relation to trying to document the impact of sanctions, invasion, occupation on women in Iraq, and working with women who are challenging not only, Western imperialism, but also challenging sectarianism, Islamism, corruption, and so on. But I did actually learn Arabic in Egypt. I lived in Cairo 5 years, and I actually got involved in the Egyptian feminist movement while studying there. So a lot of my work and connections are with the Egyptian feminist movement. And more recently, I was kind of dismayed by the way. Well, first of all, I was frustrated. And I was really depressed by the situation in Iraq. And after I'd written an article about the impact of ISIS, Daesh, on gender-based violence in Iraq, I felt I needed to take a break just for my own sanity, really. And in 2015, the situation in Turkey still looked much better, and there was a peace process going on. But I was kind of skeptical about the way that the Western media was portraying Kurdish women, the kind of glorified, exoticized fighter, without really kind of historicizing or putting these fighters in context, because I saw this paradox. So you have this in the New York Times and all the European newspapers, images of these very sexy Kurdish women fighting Daesh, but at the same time you have the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, that is actually underlying some of the ideology why these women are fighting, criminalized in most European countries. So I wanted to look more carefully at the Kurdish women's movement and looked at the way that Turkish feminists and Kurdish feminists work together on peace in Turkey. Only when I started in 2015, the peace process went down, and I mean, I did research, but it was quite difficult. And also, more recently, I've worked in the context of Lebanon. In Beirut, you have a very active queer feminist movement, and I'm involved with a journal that's based in Beirut called Kohol, a journal of body and gender research, which is probably one of the first journals in the region that's published online in Arabic and English, that's really challenging heteronormativity, that's tackling taboo issues around sexuality and the body. And so working in these very different contexts, and I'm based in London, I'm not a grassroots activist on the ground, but I'm not just an academic, I'm a feminist activist working with different women's movements in the region. I'm always confronted with the differences in terms of the different countries. So of course a woman in Iraq has very different challenges than a woman in Lebanon. I mean, in Iraq we're speaking very basic survival in the light of the occupation, in light of sectarianism. I mean, in Beirut we are talking challenging sectarianism, but yes, being able to challenge heteronormativity. I mean, that's, women in Iraq can't go there. I mean, that would be death sentence, basically. Even being a feminist is already, we had just a few weeks ago, we had 4 women killed in Iraq, for blogging and for sort of stepping out the norm. But also, and I, will stop here because I want to give Rachida the chance. I mean, often in my work, I find, this tension between feminists based in various Western contexts in Europe and North America, and if you are of Muslim or Middle Eastern background in those contexts, of course, a big chunk, and for all of us, I mean, big part of the struggle is fighting Islamophobia and racism, right? But many activists in the Middle East are worried about the emphasis that some people in the West put on fighting imperialism, fighting Islamophobia, fighting racism, at the expense of speaking about local and regional factors such as religion or the interpretation of religion, the interpretation of Islam, the interpretation of Christianity, and local power configurations. You cannot, like in the Iraqi context, of course, for a long time, I had to work on the impact of the occupation in order to explain to people here why women are not doing very well. But, to be honest, after 15 years, I can't just explain away the situation in Iraq by reference to the occupation. I mean, I have to speak about local thugs. I have to speak about corrupt politicians. I have to speak about sectarian Islamists. And it's not an either or. But I think here the issue of positionality, depending on where you're based, you might emphasize one or the other. And sort of my point has been, but we have to be careful not to undermine activists in the region, who do talk about Islam and culture, not in the essentialized way that it's done in many Western contexts.
Rachida, would you care to, how do you address the local power configurations, and how do you put something, do you prioritize within the intersectional frame of all power configurations that we have to fight? Whilst fighting for equality, we have to fight against racism, and many of those things. How do you handle it?
Well, I would like also to come back to something that you said and put the emphasis on what we share in our struggles and what we have in common. And I think all women have in common over the whole globe is that our world is totally infested by patriarchy, whiteness, and capitalism, right? So it's basically the same system employing different mechanisms. Like when you said that you have to address Islamism, the problem is that means that you have to address patriarchy, you have to address imperialism in order to address Islamism. Because a couple of years ago, when we started to talk about Daesh a lot, and I did some research, I wrote an article back then where I called it the Ramboification of Islam, because you could see the pictures of these young men all looking very much like Rambo, like the Orientalist projection of what it is to be a Muslim these young men that grew up in the West, that learned, that internalized a Western gaze on their history and their identity, all of a sudden internalized it, and they became this hipster Islamists. But there's a red line between all these systems of oppression, whether it's Islamism, whether it's corruption, whether it's, you know, all the systems of oppression have these things in common, is that they're infested by patriarchy, whiteness, and capitalism. And that's actually how, where I'm standing from here. It's how I approach also the question of quote-unquote feminism. Because I have, of course, an issue with the word, because it's a concept that is in reaction to patriarchy, but that does not offer an alternative for patriarchy. Feminism is wanting equal rights within a patriarchal system. Of course, I cannot comply with that. I mean, I refuse to live in a patriarchal system, so we need to address the system first. How do we break down patriarchy? How do we break down capitalism and whiteness? Because I feel that in all the emancipatory and liberation struggles against these systems, we have always addressed the symptoms and never the cause. So that's how I try to address the struggle, in trying to create and build strategies on a local level, but connected to international networks and struggles, in order to dismantle, and if not dismantle, because that's what I believe very much in, that we don't really need to dismantle a dying system.
So what is your strategy if you're not dismantling it? Are you ignoring it? Are you...
No. My strategy is build another system. Put all our focus, all our energy, or all our creativity, all these hybrid generations that we are educating all over the world. Like, for instance, this morning, somebody asked me, do you consider yourself first or second generation migrants? And I told them my parents migrated. I didn't. Second generation migrants, doesn't exist. It's something that's... Do you even stop to think about what you're saying? Either you migrated or you didn't. Right? Yes. I didn't. How can I be second generation migrant? What I am, though, is a first generation hybrid species. And a language orphan. I often call myself a language orphan, because I think these new narratives and languages that we have to create. Language is a very powerful tool, right? I mean, patriarchy and whiteness have constructed themselves by creating the narrative and the language that goes with it. So creating new narratives and new languages is something that is long overdue, but I do not feel I have the right to just come up with words that describe me. I, for instance, do not identify as a woman. I do not identify as a man. I do not go by they, them, because to me, whatever you're going to call me in these patriarchal languages is a box, feels like a prison. So I do not, I never tell people how to address me. You address me however you feel like. Most of the time is woman, of course. I mean, that's what people see when they see me. But I do not identify as such, and I'm not going to invent a word for it, because I very much believe in organic conspiracy. We're going to create these narratives together.
Yeah. So, when coming back to you being a language orphan, you would be the kind of language orphan that rejected, that killed the parents, and then because you're rejecting language is too limiting, and you are right in that, because what we see is how we address to you by what we see is by what we interpret as feminine. So I understand that. I saw you.
Yeah, I really would like to come back to. So, as someone who does identify as a feminist, I think what you're describing as feminism for me is sort of on the continuum of what I would call patriarchal bargain, and you know, I think sort of the idea that many women and men, instead of fighting patriarchy, are sort of trying to make the system work for themselves. So they're engaging in patriarchal bargain, to the kind of continuum of what I would call a liberal rights feminism, sort of the idea we need to have equal number of women in parliament, we need to have women to fight in the military, we need to have women, you know, in the economy and so on, but keep the system, but just have equal representation. So that's not the feminism that myself, but also most of the feminists that I know would adhere by. But then of course the sort of the question is, so what do you do in terms of actually challenging the system? And yeah, I feel I've changed a bit over time, and I've just actually, I was quite humbled by, you know, the feminist activists in Iraq and Lebanon, where I feel sort of for me it's often much easier to be being based in London, and I guess it's sort of for you, I don't want to make assumptions, but because it's, you know, there are of course lots of challenges being based in Brussels. But so when I speak to, just recently in Beirut, you know, I asked some quite radical queer feminists, so why do you actually engage with elections in Lebanon? I mean, the elections in Lebanon are very corrupt. You are sort of engaging with the system. You know, why don't you sort of, you know, try to build something parallel? And over again, I find that, you know, feminists in the region do come, you know, who maybe started out as rejecting the system and rejecting to engage, say that actually, no, we do have to engage. We do need to have an impact on, you know, the elections. And I mean, personally, I have to say I wouldn't get involved in the elections in Lebanon, because I think it becomes like a tokenistic gesture. But I do understand why, you know, for most sort of feminists in the Middle East, it would be a kind of utopian and almost too privileged position to say, oh, you know, yes, of course, I want to challenge patriarchy, but I can only challenge patriarchy in a kind of more from within way. And then there is, of course, it depends on how much freedom you have. So like in Lebanon, you have the freedom to be a queer feminist activist. You don't have that freedom in Iraq, basically. So I think that, yes, in an abstract, I see what you're saying, but then, you know, I guess when it comes down to everyday struggles in specific context where the spaces, you know, to actually come out and challenge patriarchy, challenge heteronormativity. Well, you know, I think in most places in the Middle East, you can't openly challenge heteronormativity. But even in spaces where you can do it, like for instance in Beirut, you know, the queer feminists, they don't come out visibly, you know, as such, because they know that they don't want to totally lose touch with their families, they don't want to be marginalized, and so they kind of find an in-between way, you know. So,
so how do we talk about transnational? You were interested, and I am too, in how do we talk international and transnational strategies to fight the same thing that we are fighting all over the world regarding those differences?
I would like to tell you briefly about a trip I made to Eritrea last year. Eritrea has gained its independence 27 years ago, after a 30 years war against imperialism. I don't know if you know a little bit about their history. And I went there last year. They had just celebrated their first 25 years of freedom, and they have this long-term strategy that is organized in blocks of 25 years. So it's not a coincidence that I went there last year. It's because now, in the second 25 years, they are reaching out to international activists that could also be an ally. Yeah. Ally, inspiration, but also talk about what I saw there, what happened there.
Sparring partner.
Yes. Yeah. So I went there, I stayed 2 weeks, and I could go everywhere I wanted, and it was very easy to talk to the people in the country because they have 3 national languages, Tigrinya, Arabic, and English. I speak 2 of the national languages, so it was very easy to communicate with everybody. And I went all over the country, the most remote villages, mountains, and I was walking freely in the streets and talking to people. Now, Eritrea, after their independence, in 25 years, they managed to eradicate malaria, take women circumcision from 96% to 0.6%. They eradicated AIDS. It's a country of 6 million and something, almost 7 million people. There are 300,000 students in university right now. All the students are going to university. This is what an African country that is one of the 10 poorest countries in the world managed to do after they get rid of capitalism.
Did they
so
do
what
this
they
first
did, what they did right after, the first thing they did, because in order to liberate themselves in this 30-year war that went on, everybody had to be in the front. The whole country was at the front, including the women. So the first thing they did was saying and acknowledging 30% of the Liberation Army were women. So from now on, there will be a quota of 30% women in every administration.
It didn't work, though. Sorry, but I mean, I know, actually, I happen to know quite a bit about Eritrea, and I always use the example of Eritrea of how not to do it. Because this is like Eritrea and Vietnam, and to some extent also, of course, you know, Palestine, you had women who were part of, you know, who 30% who were fighting, you know, and there was this whole kind of very radical ideology behind it. It was much more than just women fighting. It was really sort of trying to build a, you know, society from scratch. After the warfare, women were pushed back. I mean, the fighters, London is a hub for former fighters and, you know, the sort of former opposition.
You've been to Eritrea too?
I haven't been to Eritrea, but no, but I mean, just because you go to Eritrea, I mean, we have in Europe a large percentage of Eritrean refugees. Why are they leaving? It's an authoritarian country.
I have the answer to that. That was not, though, the conversation that we wanted to have. Maybe it's better we have it afterwards. Yeah. But there's a good reason to that. For instance, because the Western countries give 100% of political asylum to Eritrea, because there's also European Western propaganda against Eritrea.
Well, I worked with Eritrean refugees.
70% of Eritrean refugees are not Eritrean refugees. They're Ethiopian, but because they speak the same language and Eritreans and not Ethiopians get political asylum, they give themselves up as Eritreans in order to get the political asylum. There are many, many things playing here. And I know what is happening. I met a lot of Eritrean refugees. I know all the story. But I went to Eritrea. I spoke to the people on the ground.
I'd like
the
to
reason
know,
I was
I'd
just
like to know,
giving,
I'd
just
like
to
to
finish
know
on this, the reason, the only thing I wanted to give as an example is when a country is free, they can finally start a real project. That's what I'm trying to say. When you're liberated from these things, because there's also a young generation of Eritrean activists that I'm in contact with, also from the diaspora, that believe very much in the Eritrean project in their home country, even though they're still here and they were refugees and now they are in a sense, making a mea culpa, because most of the people that left because their privileges were taken away. That's what happened in a socialist country. So most of the real refugees were children of people that had privileges, of the middle class, and that left. And now they want their privileges
I'd like to know
back.
I'd like to know the rest of your sentence, because you said after the war, 30%, they looked at how many people were in the army and then they tried to install
so
this.
now there is a law in Eritrea that every administration you have to have 30% of women, period. Every administration has 30% women.
And has that been achieved?
I'm not saying it's the way to go. What I'm saying is when you get rid of these oppressive systems, your country can finally... Of course, I'm not saying we have to follow the Eritrean context. The Eritrean context is in Africa and very specific. Yeah, we have to find our own models. What I'm saying is we can start look at these countries that rid themselves of these oppressive systems and then start learning of what are their experiences. Because, of course, I talked with a lot of women that are in power in Eritrea, and they are very concerned also about these things. And they're telling about that now they have the freedom to try out things. It doesn't work. we try out something else, but at least they have a context where they can try out stuff for real.
I think that's important. The privilege to make mistakes in a country that's young and new.
Voilà.
And I think that many of those things may work out. And I'm also interested in the example of this country that has been doing this ahead of us, and also what kind of mistakes they made. And I think you both have the full picture here. So what do you see that went wrong, Nadje, from your experience in people who fled to London still after this?
Well,
quota?
I mean, I thought this was anyway. I think we're supposed to focus on the Middle East. I mean, I'm not an expert on Eritrea, but Eritrea comes up in the context of the Kurdish women's struggle as one of the example of how not to do it, because Eritrea and Vietnam and Algeria and Palestine are often cited as examples when women were actually involved in active warfare, but then when the armed struggle finishes, women were sort of pushed back. And that happened to some extent in the Eritrean context as well. And I mean, one of the things that I found very interesting in the Kurdish women's struggle is, you know, for a Kurdish woman to tell me, I was actually really shocked. She said, you know, we have to imagine, I mean, Kurds don't have a country, right? And you would think that the national struggle would be sort of the main thing. And several Kurdish women told me, you know, the problem that we have with the Turkish state, we can resolve with 3 articles in the constitution. But the problem with our Kurdish men will take a much longer time. So the conflict we have is not just the conflict with the Turkish state, it's a conflict with our men as well. For me, that was very revolutionary, I have to say. And then going back to the quota, I mean, the quota...
Wouldn't that go for Eritrea as well? Because I see what you said, the struggle was against another suppressor, another system that was weighing down on everyone. Just like I think black North Americans or black Senegalese fighters were here in the First World War because we had some kind of commonalities, and then when the war was over, were pushed aside. I think there's 2 enemies here, and I think that might be the thing with intersectionalism.
Well, I mean, as much as I have been inspired by the Kurdish women's struggle, and I think it's probably one of the most radical feminist struggles, I'm also worried about a movement where when you go and you're being educated, what you read is Abdullah Öcalan, Abdullah Öcalan, Abdullah Öcalan, right? And if you kind of step outside of the norm, you're being, you know, trained for 3 months in a camp and you're reading Abdullah Öcalan. And that, you know, there is, and also sexuality in order to be equal, and that was the case in Vietnam as well, in Eritrea. In order to be egalitarian within that struggle, you have to become sexless. I mean, not just genderless in the non-binary way, but, you know, no sex, right? I mean, the only difference between the Kurdish and the Eritrean and the Vietnamese is that it now applies to men as well. So men are not supposed to have sex either, whether it's heterosexual or heteronormative. And for me, I think there is, personally, although I have lots of sympathy and I've also, you know, feel inspired by the Kurdish women's struggle, but there is an element of fascism for me in there. If you, first of all, there's only one person you read and sexuality is totally blocked out. I find that really troubling, actually.
So what are the lessons to be drawn then from the both examples that you named to work with the transnational knowledge about feminism? Because we are fighting this all over the world and we need to draw from what the other women and men are discovering in the same struggle, right?
I mean, Rachida, I don't know what Rachida thinks, but for me, I think there is this sort of question of transnational solidarity, right? What is my role and responsibility as someone being based in London, having the privilege of being linked to an academic institution? I mean, I think a lot of humility has to go into my encounter, you know, with activists and also fellow academics in the region. Also, I think over the years, I've moved away from very strong righteous positions to sometimes embrace ambivalence. I think ambivalence is not a bad thing, that sometimes we cannot be sure about, like, you know, for instance, I used to be so sure that military intervention is wrong. You know, in the context of Iraq, I was very sure. I wasn't so sure anymore in the context of Syria, right? Or in the context of Kurds in North Syria. I'm not saying that I said I'm for military intervention, but I'm just not so sure anymore. But also, crucially here, what I think it's very important to keep in mind our privilege and our positionality. I feel it would be wrong if I would not express my criticism, right? I'm not just saying, oh, because you're Eritrean, you know it, or because you're Lebanese or Iraqi. No, I can express my criticism, and I feel it's also my responsibility to say, well, maybe there's a problem here.
Mm-hmm. What about you?
I think I have a quite, on that part, I have a quite different approach because I don't have an academic background. I didn't study in university.
I don't think you need to connect to something, some reality that is different and that is at the same time similar to yours. I don't think you needed the grid. Do you feel you need to? No.
No. What I'm saying is from where I'm working and thinking, because I don't have an academical background, but I teach myself. I also don't believe that white universities can learn me anything about me and my condition. I'm over that. So I just choose what education I would get, and I did it for myself. And from where I am thinking my condition, analyzing it and building strategies, I feel so deeply connected to so many quote-unquote women in the whole world. And yeah, Eritrean women, it was one of the connections I felt, by the way, in Eritrea, when they have this 1 year, after they're 18, they have this 1 year of service they have to do before going to university, and they get to read James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. So that's, I think, quite different. Yeah, it's pretty good. I was quite surprised by many of the things they do, and that was one of them. The authors they get to read in their 1 year of military service. But women I'm mostly actually inspired by, and I feel connected with, and I think they did find the words to describe me and who I am. They did find artistic formats and ways and whatever, is Black trans women from the States.
And why do you think that their identities or hyphenated identities? I think. Why do you think there's so much?
There we come back to the intersections.
Why is it so specific that it's Black, trans, or gender? Or
the number of intersections. Like when you have all the intersections and you carry them on your body, it's a completely different place to create from. And I think that's where the most relevant art is created, where the most relevant narrative is created. That's when I found, when I heard Alok Vaidmanan about 6 years ago for the first time, that was the life changer for me. And for me, I all of a sudden heard this alien language that I never heard before, but that moved me, that touched me, that I started crying without even noticing it. I was like, what's happening with me? And just the impact of the narrative, and also the physical expression of these women. And I just felt like this is what we need right now. This is what all of us need. They are creating the narrative that will include everybody because they carry all the intersections on their bodies.
So it's a part of recognizing and feeling represented, and recognizing much of the struggle in what they. Wow, no, it's not quarter to 8 already. No, no, I'm denying this. It's not true. No, please set back your clocks. Is it already winter time? Oh no, we're nearing the end. No, I'm really objecting tonight. Let's cancel the performance after this. No. Oh, Now I feel pressured to have this one good last question. But I want to answer to what you said at the moment that I experienced a similar thing when I read Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. No, it's a very long poem, and afterwards I realized he was challenging gender as well, or maybe he was a gay man in this 19th century, which was not gonna go into that. But it was a phrase. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. And I think that's the most important thought of tonight, that all these women all over the world contain multitudes and are confronting a multitude of a multitude of power relations whilst fighting for the right just to be whoever they want to be. I'm not going to take up more of the time that we have left. We still have 10 to 15 minutes, but I'd like for you both to elaborate on that thought of how much of the transnational is used and then rejected in your own practices, and how you move back and forth. It's not a straight line, as you were saying before. I think we have to find ways, and it's more of a meandering that we do in between the power struggles that we face daily and the literature that we read and go to and look for to give us strength. Maybe that's a question I want to. I think both of you have talked about this being a very draining yet important activity that we do. What are your power sources? What makes you really reload and go into the world again to fight this?
Well, similar to Rachida, it's the connections with women, and I guess for me it was originally in Egypt where I lived, and I guess I sort of became a feminist in the Egyptian context where I was studying, and I was taken along by a Palestinian friend to a Egyptian leftist feminist organization, and I sort of started to comment, and she said, why don't you get involved? So, you know, that connection, and then obviously having family in Iraq, you know, it's not because I have family, but it's because of what Iraq went through, and I have family, and I did, at some point, I never forget, in the 90s, when I was able to move in and out of Iraq while my relatives were stuck, you know, I just thought, if I would be, you know, my cousin, the same age, who can't ever leave Baghdad, you know, who was not able to access the internet, you know, who was living under dictatorship and sanctions. And I had this cousin, you know, with a German passport who could move freely all over. How would I feel about it? And I was so humbled by them just being happy for me that I had this life. And so, you know, the connection with Iraqi feminists that, you know, I'm meeting regularly, that I'm working with. Now, I have to say that at some point, I found it difficult also for myself with my politics to work with Iraqi feminists to have very different politics. I mean, they are quite socially conservative. You know, they're often more on a spectrum between sort of liberal feminist and Islamic feminist, and there are amazing women there, but I have to say I feel much more connected to the Turkish or Lebanese young feminists who are kind of also challenging ideas around gender binaries and, you know, sexuality. But you know, it's not possible in the Iraqi context. So, but it's a connections. And of course, as someone who's teaching, it's also my students. You know, I think teaching is a very rewarding thing, and I take your point about white university, but you know, I guess I have been privileged to be at a place like SOAS.
You're at SOAS, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but it's, you know, it's tricky because, you know, SOAS has the first black female director in the UK. I cried the day she was appointed because I felt, and I was on the appointment committee, and I felt I should be happy. She was appointed by Tony Blair to ramp up support for the Iraq war in various African countries, and she was a supporter of the Iraq war, right? And so I was, very upset that she should be the person, Baroness Valerie Amos. But then, after she was appointed, a month later, there was, of course, at SOAS, we have every month, we have occupations, student occupations. And there was this big banner, a part of the university was occupied, and it said, Valerie Amos, first you destroyed Iraq, now you're destroying SOAS. And I didn't like it, I have to say. I didn't like it because of equating, first of all, stupid SOAS with Iraq. Sorry to say, it's just a little academic institution, and Iraq is a country with millions of people. But also I felt, okay, give her a chance, actually.
Did she take it?
Yeah, and I have come around to like her. We might not agree on everything, but I think, again, it's so difficult, being a black woman director in that context. I think she's, it's not easy. But, at the same time, she was a Blairite, so it's really tricky.
So Zineb Ahmed?
Yeah, yes.
Friend of mine. Right. Pain in the ass, right? Organizing all this, occupations in SOAS.
The occupation is your friend. So that's why you were laughing. You know the slogan. What are your power? How do you where do you plug into to find new strengths?
I'm finding my strength in my victories. The strategies that I'm implementing and the work that we're doing with our communities is paying off. And we're finding ourselves celebrating almost every week. We don't have enough money to celebrate all the things we have to celebrate. I've been an activist for quite a while, and it's been years and years of just burnouts and depression, and now it's basically just taking the fruit of the work and gathering, piling up the victories in our communities with this strategy that we have, turning our backs to the system and investing in our own people, implementing that on a local level and with networks and within the art and culture sector. That's the sector in which I look for the breaches, and the amount of victories that we are getting within art and culture scene are just amazing, and it gives us a lot of strength, a lot of motivation to build on victories rather than to build on,
Do you feel the arts and culture sector is it the easiest to breach?
I think so. I think that for us, the oppressed quote-unquote minorities, because we're not minorities, but that's how we're still called. But that's the thing. We stop seeing ourselves within my strategy as minorities.
No, we're not. No.
Because we are the fucking 99%, okay? So we just need to also start act upon that. And that's what we do. And it gives a lot of results. And so these victories that we share in the communities and the celebrations and the warmth and the community itself, my partner, my family, my mother, my sisters, all the friends, the local friends, the international friends, all these energies of meeting and just sharing power, sharing victories, creating power, put it on the table, sit together next to each other around the table. How are we going to use the power that we created? And then we delegate, and then we strategize. That's where I keep taking my energy, because we keep building on top of victories, and we feel that within what we are doing, we are very much aware of the system around us falling down, because all our strategy is based on the system falling down. It's because we are aware of it. So we watch it from very close by, because it's in this falling down system that you will notice the breaches. Mm-hmm. And that's what we do, and I take a lot of energy from that.
No. I was expecting applause. No, joking. Question, yeah. Do we have a microphone for the questions? Thank you. Here, up front, Christina. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. I have a question to Nadje, because I found it highly intriguing what you said about ambivalence and about sort of like that you're very certain and sure about certain things 15, 20 years ago, and that has changed a little bit. Could that be part of a political strategy? Could that be part of activism, embracing ambivalence, embracing uncertainty, or is it something which is sort of like limited to the sphere of reflecting things?
No, I think it can be part of a strategy. I mean, I want to think that it's not just a reflection on getting older. I mean, that would be a bit sad. But I think it might have something to do with it. But no, I think it's more than that. But I think sort of reflection over a period of time has something to do with it, and age comes into play. But no, I think that very early on, I had problems with these very sort of rigid positions and polarized positions. And very early on in my sort of political life, I've kind of taken not the middle ground, but a ground that's challenging the. So, for instance, I give you an example. One of my most traumatic experiences politically was in 2005, 2 years after the invasion of Iraq. I was invited to a World Tribunal on Iraq, which was the last in a series of several tribunals. There was one in Brussels, one in Tokyo, and was organized by the global left, and the last one was in Istanbul. And it was a 3-day event in Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. And I was supposed to speak on the last day on the impact of the occupation on women in Iraq. And in 2005, on a weekly basis, innocent civilians were killed in Iraq by the so-called insurgents who laid bombs at marketplaces or, were targeting civilians, not just the occupation. And for 3 days, I was listening to speakers either starting or finishing their talk. We have to support the armed resistance against imperialism, right? And I couldn't do it. Right? And I couldn't do it not because I don't believe in armed resistance against imperialism, but because I felt that the resistance that we saw emerge in Iraq was actually mainly targeting innocent civilians. And even, to be honest, I had problems with them targeting Iraqi police and interpreters. I didn't like it. Anyway, so I said this. And on my panel, if you don't, Samir Amin, he just recently passed away. I was sort of one of my heroes, a kind of Marxist scholar. He jumped up and he said, "This is not the time to be divisive," right? So we are supposed to take positions. And yes, I took a position, but my position was, for me, it was the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend, right? And I also had that during anti-sanctions campaigning. I was very, very dismayed with much of Western anti-sanctions campaigning, which was not speaking about the atrocities by the Saddam Hussein regime. So as an anti-sanctions campaigner in the 90s in Britain, you were speaking about the British government, about the US government, but you were not talking about the Iraqi government that was repressing people, that was killing Kurds, that were killing Shia, that was killing anyone in opposition. It's not an either or. So that is, I guess, not ambivalence. But I think sort of my feeling of sort of this rejecting, falling into these binaries and feeling ambivalent are somehow connected.
Another question? Yes. Najma, Anne is running towards you. I think that's her workout for this week.
So, thank you very much, Rachida and Nada, all the speakers. And in fact, I would like just to maybe comment or add an idea about new narrative to challenge the system. I will maybe add that those new narratives are already in process, and they exist, and they are in a kind of transformative time. I might add that those narratives are not yet visible, or not yet, they lack to have a kind of sustainable means, and to be part of the the story, the contemporary story, because they do exist, they are in process. So my question will be, how do you think could be strategies of having them part of the big story of our contemporary life, and how this strategy can give them sustainability?
Strategies of narratives?
To maintain, sustain, stimulate this new narrative that are already part of our life, that are already in art, in culture, in
Yes.
in our context. But how do we let them visible?
How do you make them structural or more
structural? How? Because now do you have like what you say the system, and you want to challenge the system. There is like the black and white, but I am interested in searching for strategies that those narratives are not like the counterpart of the official narrative.
That's a process. You mean both the binary?
Yes.
Yeah.
By investing in them, I think, simply by using them. I wrote a whole book in a new kind of language. It's written in Dutch, but it's a completely new language, a new narrative. And it's exploring narratives. And a lot of, like you say, a lot of artists do that, whether it's through film or music or dance or writing, poetry. And I think what we need to do is invest in them, is consume politically, consume art and culture strategically and politically. You pull back your energy and your presence from white and patriarchally and capitalist-inspired art. You don't consume it. This is also the whole conversation that took place after the hashtag #MeToo, right? Like, do you separate the art from the artists? Well, had we done that, we would have never made these pigs big. With all due respect for the pigs, I like piggies. But I think it's important to start consuming art and creating art and participating in art that is relevant, that is building another narrative, that is building another society, and stop consuming the art that is inspired by patriarchy and whiteness and capitalism. I don't know if I answered your question, if that was the question.
If I can just add, and I agree with what Rachida is saying here. So I guess in my area, I would add education, obviously. So when I teach a course on gender and sexuality in the Middle East, I'm very aware that I don't teach it in a vacuum. So everyone in the classroom, wherever the student comes from, already is imbued with a hegemonic narrative. And that might not be the same, they might be sort of different, but everyone has a very strong idea about women and sexuality in the Middle East. So I have to work through layers and layers of that. And I guess, teaching is one way where you can do that. And you do that by, through the themes that you address and through the text and also visuals that you use and the discussions. But also, I think for me, it has been a learning curve to really recognize that you say narrative, maybe I've put it slightly differently, kind of discourse making or narrative making does not only happen in academic circles or in the media and policy. Rachida is referring to the artistic and cultural scene. I'm referring to activist scene. So I've been working with activists like in Lebanon. There is this journal, I already referred to it, Kohl, a journal of body and gender research. One idea behind it is for young regional feminists to actively engage in discourse making about gender, sexuality, and the body. And the journal is available online. It's for free. It's both in Arabic and English and French. And so it actually reaches lots of people in the region internationally and has a huge impact in challenging some of our ideas around gender and sexuality.
Do you also use the concept of artivism?
Well, I personally not, but I know that people do, and I think it's a great concept, yeah.
That's what we call Le Space, actually, an Artivist Hub.
I'm very sorry. I don't think I can take any new questions. I do think we have all the luxury of... yes, Anne is agreeing to a new question. It's the first time this week. Who is a lucky person? Who is it? Who is it? Who is it? Who is it? You're so lucky. You're so privileged. The last question of the whole week and the festival, ladies and gentlemen. Hi. Maria.
Yeah, you know me. So I had a question for Rachida. You were talking about the case in Eritrea, about the 30% quota in every institution now. Do you think it's a kind of solution we can apply here, for example, in Belgium? And do you think it can have more benefits than bad sides? Because there are a lot of institutions now that use that kind of quota. Maybe not 13, but less. And do you think it's a way towards something better, or it can be tricky and becomes some, I don't know.
It is tricky. It's not as simple. It is very complicated. I have to say, of course, I don't believe in quotas as an objective, but I do believe it as a means, as one of many means, but with which we have to be very careful, because wanting to have 30% women and, let's say, 30% people of color within political parties, fuck party politics, right? I mean, no. It's the whole system is based on this, what I called earlier, these three big systems of oppression. The whole system is invested by that. All the institutions that we have been built and created to sustain that system. So we're just asking to be represented when we ask to implement quotas within systems whose structure has been built to uphold the system. And that's what is problematic with quotas. It's not quotas in such, it's how, where, why. Representation within a sick system is just asking to be represented and to be competitive within oppression, asking for the right to oppress, basically. That's what quotas means within this system. But at the other hand, we can't just not try out this difference. I hope that, for me, I believe very much in creating alternative platforms, creating alternative grassroots, bottom-up projects, structures in all domains, whether it's agriculture, whether it's education, we have to first create our projects, the way we see them, the way we want to educate our kids, the way we want to cultivate the food that we want to put in our stomach, because that's one of the, that's one of the biggest criminal things that happen to us, is we don't have the right to choose what we put in our bodies, and everything we eat, everything we breathe makes us sick.
I'm wondering, sorry to interrupt you, I'm wondering if it can it be both? Can it be that we, as a, I don't know which we, would infiltrate or would go for representation while installing and
I understand your question, and yes, but only if you create these alternative systems outside the institutions, right? Whether it's film, whether it's distribution, platforms, whatever, to build up power in the margin. Once you have that margin, it is useful to have people within the system that will help you transfer that power into continue to dismantle these institutions, not to change them, not to decolonize them. You cannot decolonize fascism or whiteness or, no, you have to break them down. You have to, these institutions have to become irrelevant. And yes, we do need people on the inside that will work with us to make these institutions irrelevant. We need professors within these universities to educate new generations that will rethink knowledge, that will rethink the creation of knowledge. You do not decolonize university, you rethink the creation of knowledge. And you do that by educating a new generation from within what we have now, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And just sort of to go back, so in the Iraqi context, it was actually just after the invasion, 15 Iraqi women activists went to then Ambassador Paul Bremer, the American person who was responsible for the occupation, and they said, we women make up the majority of the Iraqi population, and we want equal representation in all bodies. We want 50% representation, right? And Paul Bremer looked at them and he said, we don't do quotas, which was, you know, really, really hypocritical, because it was all about when they institutionalized the Iraqi governing council, it was so many Sunnis, so many Shia, so many Arabs, so many Turks. So it was all about quota. But when it came to gender, we don't do quota. Anyway, this was actually a successful instance of transnational feminist solidarity, because Iraqi women feminists inside and Iraqi feminists outside and other feminists outside lobbied when there was a new constitution that there would be a quota enshrined. So they moved away from equal representation to 25%, which is still substantial when you compare it to many other countries. What did it mean in practice? It meant the wives, sisters, daughters of conservative male politicians, mainly, although there were some women who made it through parliament who would have never made it otherwise. Initially, the women, the 25% women, most of them would look, what are the men voting, before they would put up their hand. But over time, that changed. Over time, women started to actually come together and started to, on certain issues, vote outside of their specific party or sectarian context. And also women started to have independent views. So I totally agree. It can never be the objective, a means as part of a wider strategy. But we know that in certain contexts, like Iraq, I know there would not be a single woman in parliament. Okay, and then also the question is, if we have these conservative women, why not have the conservative women while otherwise there would be conservative men, hoping that with time they might start to develop. But I totally agree that if this is the only thing, it can be sometimes damaging then, because then it's tokenistic, then, you know, we're actually starting to be complicit. And of course, and this is where I feel that the Kurdish movement, I said lots of negative things about them, but actually when you look at what they've done in southeastern Turkey, when you look what they've done in northern Syria, they are trying to create a society from scratch. And women are at the center, so it's not only that every leadership position there's a woman and a man, but you know, you have any kind of, whatever you think, there's sort of women's branches. And if anything, there's a kind of parallel women's society emerging that's very powerful. It has problems, but I think it's also important to look at it in a sort of more complex manner and take inspiration from it as well.
Just one simple word to you, Nadje, Rachida, but also Christina and Anne. Where are you now, Anne? Just one simple, yet truly deeply felt thank you. I hope that we continue these conversations off stage, online, offline, in journals. I hope we continue collaborating and drawing from this transnational knowledge and specific, translating them into our specific settings, and never lose the will to change things, because we need to. That's what we learn.